The story everyone thinks they know is only the surface, and what lies beneath is far more powerful and far more inspiring. What the world saw that October evening was a woman standing alone in a hospital parking lot, exhausted after another 16-hour shift, watching a military helicopter descend from the darkening sky. What the world did not see were the 17 years that led to that moment, the quiet brilliance dismissed by those who should have known better, the moral choice that cost her everything, and the crisis that would prove she had been right all along. This is not just a story about being vindicated. This is about the price of integrity in a system designed to silence those who speak truth, and about the moment when that same system came crawling back because they finally understood what they had thrown away. Sarah Martinez stood in the employee parking lot of St. Catherine Regional Medical Center, her navy blue scrubs still damp with sweat despite the October chill settling over the city. The motion sensor lights above her had clicked off 3 minutes ago, leaving her in the amber glow of distant street lamps. Her feet ached with the specific throb that came from standing on hospital linoleum for 16 consecutive hours, the kind of pain that started in the arches and radiated up through the calves until every step felt like walking on broken glass. She had stopped noticing it years ago, the way a soldier stops hearing gunfire after enough time in combat. But tonight, standing alone in the darkness with her shift finally over, she felt every burning nerve ending in her feet, every screaming muscle in her lower back, every accumulated hour of exhaustion from a week that had pushed her body past reasonable limits. The parking lot stretched empty before her, a vast expanse of painted lines and oil stains gleaming faintly under the scattered lights. Her Honda Civic sat alone in the far corner where she always parked, as far from the hospital. Entrance as possible to leave the closer spots for visitors and patients. It was a 20-year-old car with rust blooming along the wheel wells and a passenger side mirror held on with duct tape. But it was hers, paid off years ago, maintained with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything in her life. The walk to that car had never felt longer than it did tonight. Sarah shifted the canvas tote bag on her shoulder, feeling the weight of her stethoscope, the extra pair of compression socks she kept in her locker, the protein bars she never had time to eat, and the worn paperback novel she optimistically brought to work every day and never opened. Her hair, pulled back in the tight bun required by hospital policy, had come loose hours ago, dark strands sticking to her neck with dried sweat. She could smell herself, that particular blend of hospital disinfectant, patient illness, and her own exhaustion that no amount of hand sanitizer could mask. It was the smell of emergency department nursing, as distinctive and unavoidable as the sound of cardiac monitors or the fluorescent hum of overhead lights. She should have been moving toward her car, should have been driving home to the small apartment she rented in a neighborhood that was affordable because nobody else wanted to live there, should have been peeling off these scrubs and standing under a hot shower until the water ran cold, should have been collapsing into bed for the 6 hours of sleep she would get before her next shift started. Instead, she stood motionless in the darkness, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of this day settling over her like a physical force. It had been 3 weeks since the meeting with hospital administration. 3 weeks since she had walked into that conference room on the 4th floor, the one with the long mahogany table and the view of the city skyline, the one where decisions got made that affected everyone below. 3 weeks since she had sat across from Director of Nursing Patricia Holloway and Chief Medical Officer Dr. Richard Chen and Hospital Administrator Marcus Webb, 3 people in expensive suits who had never worked a floor shift in their lives, who had never held the hand of a dying patient or explained to a mother why her child could not be saved, who made decisions based on spreadsheets and profit margins and liability concerns rather than the messy, complicated reality of human suffering. 3 weeks since she had told them the truth about what was happening on the emergency department floor, about the systematic understaffing that was putting patients at risk, about the pressure from administration to discharge patients faster, regardless of their condition, about the corners being cut to meet arbitrary metrics that had nothing to do with quality care. 3 weeks since she had documented every policy violation, every safety concern, every instance where patient welfare had been sacrificed to financial considerations. 3 weeks since she had done exactly what her nursing license required her to do, what her moral obligation demanded. What 17 years of experience had taught her was right. 3 weeks since they had thanked her for her concerns, assured her they would investigate thoroughly, and asked her to keep the conversation confidential while they reviewed the matter. 3 weeks since she had walked out of that conference room believing that speaking up would make a difference, that the system would correct itself when confronted with evidence, that doing the right thing would be rewarded rather than punished. She had been so naive. The termination letter had arrived by certified mail 2 weeks later. It cited performance issues that had never been mentioned in 17 years of employment, documented incidents that had never occurred, complaints from colleagues who she knew had never said a word against her. It was a masterpiece of corporate fiction, carefully constructed to provide legal cover while destroying her career. The message was clear, even if the words were carefully neutral. Speak up about what you see, and we will erase you. Sarah had not fought it. She had not hired a lawyer or filed a grievance or gone to the media with her story. She had not done any of the things that people always say they would do when faced with injustice, because she understood something that idealists never grasp until they are standing in the wreckage of their own principles. The system protects itself. The institution wins. The individual who stands alone against power gets crushed, and nobody remembers their name 6 months later. So she had signed the separation agreement with its non-disparagement clause and its waiver of all legal claims. She had taken the 2 weeks of severance pay they offered, a calculated insult for 17 years of service. She had cleaned out her locker, returned her hospital identification badge, and walked out of St. C. Catherine Regional Medical Center for what she believed was the last time. Except she had not been able to stay away. Not completely. Not when she knew that the emergency department was still chronically understaffed, that patients were still being rushed through their care, that the same dangerous condition she had reported continued unchecked. So she had done something that probably qualified as pathetic by any reasonable measure. She had applied for a position at the hospital laundry service, the contractor that washed all the linens and scrubs for St. Catherine and 3 other medical facilities in the region. It was minimum wage work, invisible labor performed by people nobody noticed, but it allowed her to stay close to the hospital, to keep her ear to the ground, to maintain some tenuous connection to the work that had defined her adult life. The laundry facility was located in the basement of the hospital's oldest building, a warren of industrial washers and dryers that ran 24 hours a day, filling the air with steam and the chemical smell of industrial detergent. Sarah worked the evening shift, 4 in the afternoon until midnight, sorting soiled linens and loading machines alongside women who spoke Spanish and Somali and languages she could not identify. They were kind to her in the way that working people are kind to someone who has clearly fallen from a higher place, offering her the easier tasks, showing her patience when she made mistakes, never asking the questions that must have been obvious. What was a former emergency department nurse doing sorting dirty sheets for $11 an hour? She never told them the truth, never explained that she was staying close to the hospital because she could not quite let go, because some part of her still believed that the situation would become so dire that administration would have no choice but to acknowledge the problem, because she needed to bear witness, even if nobody was listening. It was not rational. It was not healthy. But it was the only way she knew how to live with what she had seen and what she had lost. Tonight had been her 3rd week in the laundry. She had worked her regular shift, 4 to midnight, breathing in steam and bleach while loading industrial dryers with surgical gowns and patient sheets. Then she had done something she had been doing every night since she started, something that could have gotten her fired from this job too if anyone noticed. She had taken the service elevator up to the main hospital, slipped through the corridors she still knew better than her own apartment, and made her way to the emergency department. She never went inside, never spoke to anyone, just stood in the hallway near the nurses' station, close enough to hear the radio traffic and the patient monitors, close enough to see the organized chaos that she had once been part of. She told herself she was checking to make sure things were okay, that her former colleagues were managing, that the patients were safe, but really she was just trying to feel connected to something that mattered, trying to remember who she used to be before everything fell apart. Tonight she had stood in that hallway for almost 4 hours, watching the emergency department handle the usual Friday evening chaos. Multiple car accidents from the interstate, a construction worker with a severed hand packed in ice, An elderly woman in respiratory distress, a teenager overdosing on fentanyl, while his mother screamed in the waiting room. She had watched her former colleagues move through the organized pandemonium with the practiced efficiency that came from years of experience, had seen them making the same impossible choices she used to make, had recognized the exhaustion in their movements that came from being asked to do too much with too little for too long. She had also seen what administration could not see from their fourth-floor offices with the city views. She had seen nurses skipping breaks because there was nobody to cover for them, had seen patients waiting hours for basic care because there simply were not enough hands, had seen corners being cut and protocols being bent because the alternative was letting people suffer. She had seen everything she had reported 3 weeks ago still happening, still putting patients at risk, still being ignored by people who cared more about quarterly earnings than human lives. And then, around 8 in the evening, she had seen something that made her blood run cold. A patient had been brought in by ambulance, a middle-aged man complaining of chest pain and shortness of breath. Classic cardiac symptoms, the kind that required immediate attention and careful monitoring. But the emergency department was overflowing, every room full, patients on gurneys lining the hallways. She had watched as the attending physician, a young doctor she did not recognize, had quickly examined the patient, ordered an EKG and blood work, and then made a decision that Sarah knew was wrong. He had classified the patient as stable and moved him to the waiting room to free up the treatment space for a trauma case coming in. Sarah had wanted to scream, had wanted to run into that emergency department and explain that you never, ever moved a potential cardiac patient to the waiting room, that the symptoms could be deceptive, that people died while waiting for care because someone made a judgment call based on available resources, rather than clinical need. But she had no authority anymore, no voice, no standing to question medical decisions. She was a laundry worker in stained clothes, who was not even supposed to be on this floor. So she had stood frozen in the hallway, watching the man be wheeled out to the waiting room, watching the emergency department staff move on to the next crisis, and feeling the familiar helplessness that had become her constant companion. She had stayed in that hallway until midnight, when her shift officially ended, watching and waiting for something she could not name. The man with chest pain was still in the waiting room when she finally left, still waiting to be seen, still alive, but for how long she did not know. She had walked down the service stairs rather than taking the elevator, had exited through the loading dock rather than the main entrance, and had found herself here in the employee parking lot, unable to make her legs carry her the final distance to her car. The October wind picked up, cutting through her damp scrubs and raising goosebumps on her arms. The sky above was that particular shade of deep blue that came just after sunset, stars beginning to emerge in the gaps between city light pollution. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, and finally forced her feet to move toward her car. There was nothing she could do about the man in the waiting room, nothing she could do about the systemic problems that had cost her career, nothing she could do but go home and come back tomorrow and do it all over again. She had made it perhaps 20 feet across the parking lot when she felt it, not heard it first, but felt it, a vibration in the air that was almost subsonic, a pressure change that made her ears pop slightly, a disturbance in the atmosphere that her body registered before her conscious mind could process what was happening. She stopped walking, confused, looking around the empty parking lot for the source of the sensation. The feeling, intensified, became a physical force that she could feel in her chest cavity, a rhythmic thumping that matched no natural rhythm. Then she heard it, a sound that did not belong in a hospital parking lot in the middle of an American city, a sound that belonged to war zones and disaster areas and military operations. The deep, powerful thud of helicopter rotors, growing louder with each passing second, approaching fast and low. Sarah looked up, scanning the darkening sky, and felt her heart begin to race with an adrenaline surge that had nothing to do with her exhausted body and everything to do with pure, instinctive alarm. The helicopter came in from the east, flying low enough that she could feel the rotor wash beginning to disturb the air around her, could see the dark silhouette against the deep blue sky. It was not a news helicopter or a medical transport. Even from a distance, even in the failing light, she could tell this was military hardware, could see the angular aggressive lines that marked it as something designed for combat rather than civilian use. The sound grew deafening, a physical assault on her eardrums that made her want to cover her ears, but she could not move, could only stand frozen in the parking lot while this impossible thing descended toward her. The Blackhawk helicopter came in fast, flaring at the last moment to bleed off speed, and settled into a hover directly above the parking lot. The rotor wash hit Sarah like a physical blow, forcing her to bend forward against the hurricane-force wind, her hair whipping around her face, her scrubs plastering against her body. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out thought, drowning out everything except the primal understanding that something massive and powerful was happening, and she was at the center of it. The helicopter hung there, perhaps 50 feet above the ground, and Sarah could see details now that made her mind struggle to process what was happening. This was a UH-60 Blackhawk. She had seen enough of them during her 2 tours with the Army Reserve to recognize the profile instantly. But this was not a training exercise or a routine transport. The side doors were open, and she could see figures inside, could see the mounted machine gun, could see the purposeful movement of soldiers in full combat gear. This was an operational military helicopter, armed and crewed, hovering over a civilian hospital parking lot for reasons that made no sense whatsoever. The parking lot lights, triggered by the motion and vibration, had clicked back on, flooding the area with harsh white light. Sarah stood in that light, one hand raised to shield her eyes from the rotor wash and the glare, trying to understand what was happening. The helicopter began to descend, dropping lower, and she saw the crew chief leaning out of the side door, saw him point directly at her, saw his mouth moving though she could not hear the words over the rotor noise. Then, impossibly, she heard her name, not shouted, not screamed, but broadcast through some kind of loudspeaker system that cut through even the helicopter noise, amplified and clear and unmistakable. Sarah Martinez. We need Sarah Martinez. She stood frozen, her mind unable to process this information, unable to make sense of a reality where military helicopters descended on hospital parking lots calling her name. This had to be a mistake, had to be some kind of misunderstanding. She was a laundry worker, a disgraced nurse, a person of no importance or authority or value to anyone. There was no reason, no possible reason, why the United States military would be looking for her. The helicopter dropped lower still, now hovering perhaps 30 feet above the ground, and Sarah could see more details. She could see the pilot in the cockpit, could see the co-pilot gesturing, could see at least 6 soldiers in the cargo area, all in full tactical gear. This was not a small operation. This was a serious deployment of military resources, and somehow, impossibly, it was focused on her. Sarah Martinez, the loudspeaker repeated, and now she could hear the urgency in the electronically amplified voice. Former Captain Sarah Martinez, United States Army Reserve. We need you to identify yourself. Captain. They had used her rank, her former rank, the one she had held during her reserve service, the one that had lapsed years ago when she had chosen to focus on her civilian nursing career instead of continuing her military obligation. Nobody had called her captain in over a decade. Nobody except the people who had access to military personnel records, who knew her service history, who understood that she had been more than just a civilian nurse. Sarah raised her hand, a gesture that felt absurd and inadequate, but was the only response her shocked mind could produce. She raised her hand like a student in a classroom, standing in a parking lot in her laundry-stained scrubs while a military helicopter hovered above her, and she saw the crew chief see her gesture, saw him speak into his radio, saw the pilot adjust the helicopter's position to center directly above her location. The Blackhawk settled lower, the landing skids now perhaps 10 feet above the pavement, and Sarah could see the crew chief clearly now. He was young, maybe 25, with the lean hardness that came from constant training and deployment readiness. He was secured to the helicopter by a safety line, leaning far out of the side door, and he was staring directly at her with an intensity that made it clear this was no mistake, no confusion, no case of mistaken identity. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, his voice barely audible over the rotor noise, even though he was now close enough that she could see the individual letters on his uniform. Ma'am, are you Captain Sarah Martinez, Former Emergency Department nurse, Army Reserve Medical Corps. Sarah nodded, still unable to speak, still unable to process what was happening. The crew chief spoke into his radio again, listened to a response she could not hear, and then looked back at her with an expression she could not quite read. Relief? Urgency? Fear? "Ma'am," he shouted, "we need you to come with us. Right now. This is a national emergency, and you have been specifically requested by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the United States Armed Forces. They were requesting her, specifically, by name." Sarah felt her knees go weak, felt the parking lot tilt slightly beneath her feet, felt the impossible weight of those words settle over her like a physical force. This was not a mistake. This was not confusion. This was real, and it was happening, and she had absolutely no idea why. Behind her, she heard shouting, turned to see hospital security guards running from the building, their radios crackling, their faces showing the same shock and confusion she felt. She saw other people emerging from the hospital, staff and visitors and patients in wheelchairs, all drawn by the impossible sight of a military helicopter in the parking lot. She saw faces in the windows of the upper floors, people pressed against the glass, phones out, recording this moment that would be all over social media within minutes. And she saw, emerging from the main entrance with a speed that suggested he had been running, Hospital Administrator Marcus Webb. He was still in his suit, despite the late hour, still projecting the authority and control that came from his position, but his face showed something Sarah had never seen there before. Confusion, uncertainty, perhaps even fear. The crew chief was lowering a rescue harness from the helicopter, the bright orange straps swaying in the rotor wash, and he was gesturing urgently for Sarah to approach. But she found herself unable to move, rooted to the pavement, her mind still trying to catch up with reality. This could not be happening. This made no sense. She was nobody. She had no skills or knowledge that would justify this kind of response. She had been fired 3 weeks ago for speaking up about safety concerns. She was a laundry worker. "Captain Martinez!" the crew chief shouted, and there was real urgency in his voice now, real fear. "Please, ma'am, we do not have time for explanations. People are dying and you are the only person who can help. We need to go right now." People are dying. Those words cut through Sarah's shock. Like a scalpel, activated something deep in her training, in her identity, in the core of who she was beneath all the disappointment and exhaustion and defeat. People were dying, and someone thought she could help. Nothing else mattered. Not her confusion, not her fear, not the impossibility of this situation. People were dying. She moved toward the helicopter, toward the swaying harness, and she saw the crew chief's face flood with relief. She stepped into the harness, felt the straps tighten around her body with professional efficiency, felt the line go taut as the winch engaged. The ground dropped away beneath her feet, and she was rising, pulled up into the belly of the Blackhawk by soldiers in tactical gear, who handled her with the careful efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times. Hands pulled her into the helicopter, removed the harness, guided her to a seat and strapped her in with quick professional movements. Someone placed a headset over her ears and suddenly, the rotor noise dropped to a manageable level, replaced by the crackling of radio traffic and the voices of the crew. "Package secure," she heard the crew chief report. "Lifting off now." The helicopter rose rapidly, the hospital falling away beneath them, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the parking lot she had been standing in moments ago. She saw Marcus Webb staring up at the helicopter, his face illuminated by the parking lot lights, his expression unreadable. She saw the security guards with their radios, the staff and visitors clustered near the entrance, all of them watching as a military helicopter carried away their former colleague for reasons nobody understood. Then the hospital was gone, lost in the darkness below as the Blackhawk banked hard and accelerated, the city lights spreading out beneath them like a carpet of stars. Sarah sat in her canvas jump seat, still in her laundry-stained scrubs, still trying to process what had just happened, while soldiers in full combat. Gear sat around her with expressions that mixed urgency and relief, and something that might have been respect. The pilot's voice came through her headset, calm and professional despite the circumstances. "Captain Martinez, We have approximately 40 minutes of flight time to the naval base. Someone will brief you when we arrive. For now, just try to stay calm and know that you are exactly where you need to be." Sarah wanted to ask 1,000 questions, wanted to demand explanations, wanted to understand what national emergency could possibly require her presence, wanted to know who had requested her and why and what they thought she could do that nobody else could. But she looked at the faces of the soldiers around her, saw the tension in their postures, the weapons held ready, the constant scan of the darkness outside, and she understood that questions would have to wait. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough to deploy military assets into a civilian area, serious enough to pull a disgraced nurse out of a hospital parking lot, serious enough that these soldiers were treating her like a critical asset rather than a confused civilian. So she sat in silence, strapped into her seat, feeling the helicopter bank and accelerate through the night sky, and tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming, tried to push past the exhaustion and confusion and focus on the one thing that mattered. People were dying, and someone thought she could help. Everything else was secondary. The flight passed in a blur of darkness and motion, the city falling away beneath them as they flew over suburbs and then open country, the lights growing sparse and scattered. Sarah stared out the open door at the landscape rushing past below, her mind racing through possibilities and finding no answers. What could she possibly know that would justify this response? What crisis required a nurse who had been fired 3 weeks ago? What situation was so dire that the military had come, looking for someone who had no current authority, no active clearance, no official standing whatsoever? The answer, when it finally came, would be worse than anything she could have imagined. But for now, strapped into a military helicopter racing through the October darkness, all Sarah could do was wait and wonder and try to remember who she used to be before everything fell apart. Try to remember Captain Sarah Martinez, Army Reserve Medical Corps, Emergency Department nurse, the person who had always done the right thing no matter the cost. That person had been buried under 3 weeks of defeat and humiliation and minimum wage labor. But maybe, impossibly, that person was still there, still capable, still needed. The lights of the naval base appeared in the distance, a sprawling complex of buildings and runways and security perimeters lit up like a small city. The helicopter began to descend, and Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate, felt the adrenaline surge that came from knowing that answers were coming, that whatever impossible situation had brought her here was about to be revealed. She tightened her grip on the canvas straps of her seat and watched the base grow larger beneath them, watched the organized chaos of a military installation on high alert, and tried to steel herself for whatever came next. The Blackhawk touched down on a designated landing pad, the skids hitting concrete with barely a bump, and immediately soldiers were moving, unstrapping Sarah from her seat, guiding her out of the helicopter and across the tarmac. She was surrounded by armed personnel, by vehicles with flashing lights, by an intensity of activity that spoke to a crisis in progress. Nobody was wasting time on explanations or pleasantries. This was an operational environment, and she was being moved with the efficient urgency of critical cargo. They led her toward a low concrete building at the edge of the airfield, through security checkpoints manned by Marines with automatic weapons, past barriers and fences and signs warning of restricted areas. Sarah's mind cataloged details automatically, the nurse in her noting the level of security, the military bearing of everyone she saw, the complete absence of anything casual or routine. This was a major operation, and she was somehow at the center of it. The building they entered was nondescript from the outside, but the interior was a revelation. Banks of computer monitors lined the walls, displaying satellite imagery and data feeds and maps marked with symbols Sarah did not recognize. Dozens of personnel in military uniforms moved through the space with focused intensity, speaking in low, urgent voices, typing on keyboards, studying displays with expressions of deep concentration. This was a command center, a place where decisions got made that affected operations across entire regions, and they had brought her here. A naval officer approached, a commander based on his rank insignia, a man in his 40s with gray at his temples and the weathered look of someone who had spent years at sea. He looked at Sarah, taking in her laundry-stained scrubs and exhausted face, and his expression softened slightly with what might have been sympathy or respect or both. "Captain Martinez," he said, and his voice was rough with fatigue and stress. "Thank you for coming. I know you must be confused, and I promise we will explain everything. But first, I need to ask you some questions to confirm your identity and service record." Sarah nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak, and the commander pulled out a tablet and began asking questions. Her service number, her dates of active duty, the units she had served with, the deployments she had been part of, the specialized training she had received. Sarah answered automatically, the information coming from a part of her brain that still remembered being a soldier, being an officer, being someone who mattered. The commander checked her answers against whatever was on his tablet, nodded with each correct response, and finally looked up at her with an expression that mixed relief and apprehension. "Ma'am, everything checks out. You are who we hoped you were. Now I need to brief you on the situation, and I need you to understand that what I am about to tell you is classified at the highest level. You cannot discuss this with anyone outside this room without explicit authorization. Do you understand?" Sarah found her voice, rough from disuse and shock. "Yes, sir, I understand." The commander gestured toward a conference room off the main operations center, a small space with a table and chairs and a large monitor on one wall. Sarah followed him inside, heard the door close behind them with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud, cutting off the noise and activity of the command center. They were alone now, and the commander's face showed the strain of whatever burden he was carrying. "Captain Martinez," he began, and then stopped, seeming to struggle with where to start. He took a breath, squared his shoulders, and began again. "Approximately 6 hours ago, we experienced a catastrophic failure in the medical systems aboard the USS Ronald Reagan, one of our Nimitz-class aircraft carriers currently operating in the Western Pacific. The failure was not mechanical. It was a coordinated cyber attack that has compromised every electronic medical system on the ship, from patient monitoring equipment to medication dispensing systems to electronic health records." Sarah felt her stomach drop, felt the implications of those words hit her like a physical blow. An aircraft carrier carried a crew of over 5,000 personnel. The medical department would be responsible for everything from routine care to emergency surgery to managing chronic conditions for thousands of people living and working in a confined environment. If the electronic systems were down, if the computers were compromised, the medical staff would be operating blind, unable to access patient histories, unable to monitor vital signs, unable to safely dispense medications. People would die. Lots of people. The attack was sophisticated, the commander continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. It specifically targeted the medical systems while leaving other ship operations largely intact. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, and they designed it to cause maximum casualties without disabling the ship itself. We believe it is a demonstration, a proof of concept for a larger attack, but right now, our immediate concern is keeping people alive on that carrier until we can restore the systems or deploy replacement equipment. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to understand why they had brought her here, what they thought she could do about a cyber attack on a ship thousands of miles away. "Sir, I do not understand. I am a nurse, not a cybersecurity expert. How can I possibly help with this situation?" The commander looked at her with an expression that mixed respect and desperation. "Captain Martinez, 18 months ago, you participated in a joint military-civilian training exercise at Walter Reed Medical Center. The exercise was designed to test emergency medical protocols in the event of a complete failure of electronic health systems. You were one of 12 medical professionals selected to participate, and according to the after-action reports, you were the only one who successfully managed patient care. Without any electronic support, you created paper-based tracking systems, developed manual medication protocols, established communication procedures that did not rely on computers. You essentially recreated 19th century hospital operations in a 21st century environment, and you did it flawlessly." Sarah remembered that exercise. It had been grueling, a 72-hour simulation, where they had been forced to manage a mass casualty scenario with no computers, no electronic monitors, no automated systems. Most of the participants had struggled, overwhelmed by the cognitive load of tracking dozens of patients manually, making medication calculations without computer assistance, coordinating care without electronic communication. Sarah had thrived, not because she was smarter or more skilled, but because she had grown up in a different era of nursing, had trained in hospitals where computers were supplementary rather than essential, had learned to trust her own observations and documentation over what machines told her. The commander of the Ronald Reagan's medical department reviewed those after-action reports. The officer continued. When his systems went down and he realized the scope of what he was facing, he specifically requested you, by name. He said you are the only person he knows who has successfully managed large-scale patient care without electronic support. He needs you on that ship, Captain Martinez. He needs you to teach his staff how to operate without the systems they have come to depend on. He needs you to help keep 5,000 people alive until we can fix this. Sarah felt the weight of those words settle over her, felt the impossible magnitude of what was being asked. They wanted her to fly to the Western Pacific, to board an aircraft carrier, to somehow teach an entire medical department how to function without the electronic systems they had trained on, relied on, built their entire practice around. They wanted her to take 18 months of experience from a training exercise and scale it up to a real-world crisis with actual lives on the line. They wanted her to be the expert she had been before St. Catherine Regional Medical Center had decided she was expendable. "Sir," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "I have not worked as an emergency department nurse in 3 weeks. I was fired from my position for reporting safety concerns. I have no current credentials, no active license in HAO, military medicine, no authority to practice on a naval vessel. How can I possibly do what you are asking?" The commander reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather credential case. He opened it and showed Sarah a military identification card with her photo, her rank, her service number. Captain Sarah Martinez, United States Navy Medical Corps, with an activation date of today and an expiration date listed as indefinite. As of 2 hours ago, you were recalled to active duty by order of the Secretary of the Navy, the commander said quietly. Your emergency department nursing license has been reinstated through military channels. You have been granted temporary credentials to practice military medicine at any level necessary to address this crisis. You have full authority to operate on the Ronald Reagan and to direct medical operations as you see fit. Every resource of the United States Navy is at your disposal, Captain. The only question is whether you are willing to help us. Sarah stared at the identification card, at her own photo looking back at her, at the rank insignia that represented authority she had not held in over a decade. She thought about the man with chest pain still sitting in the waiting room at St. Catherine Regional Medical Center, still waiting for care that might come too late. She thought about the systematic understaffing and dangerous conditions she had reported, the truth that had cost her everything and changed nothing. She thought about 3 weeks of sorting dirty laundry while the work she loved continued without her, while patients suffered because the system valued profit over care, while people who had never stood at a bedside made decisions about life and death based on spreadsheets and liability concerns. And she thought about 5,000 sailors on an aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific, facing a medical crisis that nobody else knew how to handle, depending on someone to help them survive until the computers came back online. 5,000 people who needed exactly the skills she had spent 17 years developing, exactly the experience that St. Catherine Regional Medical Center had decided was worthless, exactly the knowledge that had gotten her fired for caring too much about patient safety. The universe had a strange sense of irony. "When do we leave?" Sarah asked, and she heard the strength returning to her voice, heard the echo of Captain Martinez, Army Reserve Medical Corps, the person she had been before defeat and humiliation had tried to bury her. The commander smiled, a genuine expression of relief and respect. "There is a C-17 transport waiting on the runway. We can have you in the air within 30 minutes. Flight time to the Reagan is approximately 14 hours. We will brief you en route on the specific situation aboard the ship, the resources available, and the challenges you will face. But Captain Martinez, I need you to understand something before we go." He paused, his expression growing serious. "What happened to you at St. Catherine Regional Medical Center was wrong. The way you were treated, the way your concerns were dismissed, the way they destroyed your career for doing the right thing. All of it was wrong. I have read your personnel file. I have read the reports you filed with hospital administration. I have read the documentation of every safety concern you raised. You were right about everything, and they punished you for it because you threatened their comfortable narrative about how well they were managing resources. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, felt 3 weeks of suppressed emotion threatening to break through her carefully maintained control. She had not cried when they fired her, had not cried when she signed the separation agreement or cleaned out her locker or started sorting dirty laundry for minimum wage. She had not allowed herself to feel the injustice of it, the betrayal, the crushing weight of being punished for integrity. But hearing this naval officer, this stranger, acknowledge what had been done to her, validate her choices, recognize that she had been right all along, it broke something loose inside her chest. The Navy does not work that way, the commander continued quietly. When you raise safety concerns in the military, people listen. When you document problems, they get addressed. When you stand up for what is right, you get supported, not destroyed. I cannot fix what Saint Catherine did to you, but I can promise you that here, in this situation, your expertise will be respected. Your judgment will be trusted. Your voice will be heard. You are not expendable, Captain Martinez. You are exactly what we need, and we are grateful that you are willing to help us. Sarah wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of laundry detergent residue on her cheek, not caring. Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. You can thank me by keeping our people alive, the commander said, standing and extending his hand. Sarah shook it, feeling the firm grip of mutual respect, feeling something shift inside her that had been broken for 3 weeks. She was not a laundry worker anymore. She was not a disgraced nurse. She was Captain Sarah Martinez, and people needed her. They walked out of the conference room and back into the operations center, and Sarah saw heads turn, saw personnel pause in their work to look at her. The word had spread. She realized. They knew who she was and why she was here. They knew that this exhausted woman in stained scrubs was about to fly halfway around the world to save their colleagues, their friends, their fellow sailors. And in their faces, she saw something she had not seen in 3 weeks. She saw respect. The commander led her through the building and back out onto the tarmac, where a massive C-17 transport aircraft sat with engines already running, cargo ramp lowered, crew moving with the efficient purpose of imminent departure. Sarah walked toward that aircraft, feeling the October wind cut through her scrubs one last time, feeling the weight of what she was about to do settle over her shoulders like a cloak. This was impossible. This was terrifying. This was exactly what she had been training for her entire career without knowing it. Someone handed her a flight suit and boots, military-issue clothing that actually fit, and directed her to a changing area where she could get out of her laundry-stained scrubs. Sarah changed quickly, mechanically, her mind already shifting into operational mode, already thinking about what she would need, what challenges she would face, what resources she would have to work with. The flight suit felt strange after 3 weeks of civilian clothes, the boots heavier than her worn sneakers, but also familiar, comfortable, right? This was who she was supposed to be. This was what she was meant to do. When she emerged, dressed in the flight suit with captain's insignia on the collar, she saw the crew chief from the Blackhawk standing near the C-17. He saluted her, a crisp military gesture that she returned automatically, and his face showed genuine relief and satisfaction. "Ma'am, I am glad you said yes," he told her. "My brother is a corpsman on the Reagan. When I heard what was happening, when I heard they were looking for you, I volunteered to be on the pickup crew. Thank you for helping them." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she kept her voice steady. "I will do everything I can. That is a promise." She boarded the C-17, was directed to a seat in the cargo area where she could rest during the long flight, was handed a briefing packet that was apparently several hundred pages of technical documentation about the carrier's medical systems and the nature of the cyber attack. She strapped herself in, felt the aircraft begin to taxi, and looked out the small window at the naval base. Sliding past, at the life she had been living 3 hours ago, already feeling like a distant memory. The C-17 lifted off smoothly, climbing into the night sky, and Sarah opened the briefing packet and began to read. She had 14 hours to prepare for the most important work of her career. 14 hours to figure out how to save 5,000 lives with 19th century methods in a 21st century environment. 14 hours to become the expert they needed her to be. It was not enough time. It would never be enough time. But it was what she had, and she would use every second of it. As the aircraft leveled off and began its long journey across the Pacific, Sarah allowed herself one moment to think about St. Catherine Regional Medical Center, about Marcus Webb standing in the parking lot watching her being carried away by a military helicopter, about Patricia Holloway and Dr. Richard Chen, who had assured her that her concerns would be investigated while they prepared her termination letter. She thought about them sitting in their comfortable offices, making their spreadsheet-driven decisions, never understanding that the nurse they had thrown away was exactly the kind of person who got called when the system failed, when the computers stopped working, when only human skill and knowledge and integrity could save lives. She hoped they had seen the helicopter, hoped they had watched her being pulled up into a military aircraft by soldiers who treated her like a critical asset, hoped they understood, even if just for a moment, that they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Not because she wanted revenge, though that impulse was certainly there, but because she wanted them to understand that the people they dismissed, the voices they silenced, the professionals they treated as expendable, those people mattered. Those people had value that could not be measured in quarterly earnings or liability concerns. Those people were the ones you needed when everything else failed. But that was a thought for later. Right now, she had work to do. Sarah turned her attention back to the briefing packet, began making notes in the margins, started developing the protocols and procedures she would need to implement. She had 14 hours to prepare and 5,000 lives depending on her. Everything else was secondary. The C-17 flew through the night, carrying Captain Sarah Martinez toward a crisis that would test every skill she had ever learned, every lesson she had ever absorbed, every principle she had ever stood for. She did not know yet that her success on the Reagan would lead to a complete overhaul of military medical training. She did not know that her protocols would become standard procedure across the entire Navy. She did not know that she would be offered a position as Director of Emergency Medical Services for the Pacific Fleet, a role that would give her the authority to implement the kind of systemic changes she had tried to advocate for at St. Catherine. She did not know that her story would become a case study in military medical schools, that her name would be synonymous with excellence under pressure, that the same people who had fired her would eventually be investigated for the safety violations she had reported, violations that had indeed led to patient deaths in the months after her departure. She did not know any of that yet. All she knew was that people were dying, and she was the only person who could help. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. That was what made her Captain Sarah Martinez. That was what made her the kind of person the military came looking for when the impossible happened. That was what made her exactly who she needed to be. The aircraft flew on through the darkness, carrying her toward redemption. She had not asked for, but absolutely deserved, toward validation that came not from the institution that had betrayed her, but from a system that understood the value of expertise and integrity, toward a future where her voice would be heard and her judgment trusted and her contributions recognized. She had stood alone in a parking lot 3 hours ago, exhausted and defeated and invisible. Now she was flying toward the most important work of her life, surrounded by people who believed in her, carrying the hopes of 5,000 sailors who needed exactly what she had to offer. The story everyone thought they knew was only the surface. What lay beneath was far more powerful and far more inspiring, and it was just beginning.